I'm Timothy, and you are in Last Memories. Today, we're looking at the worst TV deaths ever recorded, and after going through every single one of these cases, not one of them went the way you would expect. From a woman who had spent her entire career building toward one defining night, to a chandelier that had hung in that same ceiling for over a century, finally running out of time in the most devastating way possible.
It was November 12, 2016, at a television studio in Atlanta, Georgia. The morning show was running its usual rotation of segments, moving quickly between news, weather, and lifestyle content. The cooking demonstration was scheduled mid-hour, a regular feature that kept the energy up between harder news items. Braden Lee was 29 years old and had been with the program for 3 years. He was comfortable in front of the camera in the way that comes from doing something every day until it stops feeling like work. That evening, he had dinner plans with his fiancée at a seafood restaurant he had been wanting to try. He had mentioned it to a colleague before the show started. He was looking forward to it. 29, engaged, dinner plans he was looking forward to. These details don't make it more tragic. They just remind you this was a Tuesday morning for him. The segment involved a guest chef preparing a dish on set while the hosts engaged with the process and tasted the food on camera. A prep rundown had been circulated before the show listing the ingredients. Sesame oil was included as a finishing ingredient. It was not verbally flagged or emphasized during the rundown. Braden had a known sesame allergy, known to some colleagues, but not formally logged in production or safety documentation. His epinephrine auto-injector had been left in his dressing room and was not immediately accessible on set. The chef prepared the dish. A portion was plated by the food stylist and handed to Braden on cue. He tasted it on camera. The segment continued normally for the first few minutes. Then he cleared his throat. Then again. His voice shifted slightly, a subtle change in tone that was easy to miss in the flow of live television. He touched his collar briefly and kept talking. The segment kept going. Crew members watching the monitor noticed he looked slightly flushed, but the floor team held back, reading it as minor on-air discomfort. The control room continued the broadcast while querying the floor for status. This is the part that I find genuinely difficult. He touched his collar. He cleared his throat twice, and the people watching him on the monitor decided it was probably nothing. I understand why. In live television, hesitation costs you, but those seconds mattered. This is where things started to go bad. His face reddened. His speech became less fluid. His breathing began to change in a way that was no longer subtle. By the time the severity was clear to the people around him, the airway involvement was already significant. The segment was halted, and medical assistance was requested on set. A production assistant was sent to retrieve his epinephrine injector from the dressing room. The communication between the floor, the control room, and the dressing room added time that was not available to add. Emergency services were called, and basic first aid measures were attempted while waiting for their arrival. Paramedics arrived within several minutes. Braden had collapsed on set by the time they reached him. He was transported to hospital immediately, where medical teams worked to address the anaphylaxis and the airway compromise it had caused. Despite immediate intervention, Braden Lee went into cardiac arrest and died shortly after arriving at the hospital. The cause of death was recorded as severe anaphylaxis with airway compromise following ingestion of a known allergen. Investigators reviewing the incident found that the sesame oil had not been flagged as an allergen risk during segment preparation, that Braden's allergy had not been formally logged in any production or safety documentation, that his epinephrine injector had not been kept accessible during the broadcast, and that the recognition of anaphylaxis symptoms on set had been delayed by crew hesitation and communication lag. I just wonder how his fiancée felt when she heard the news of his death. So tragic.
It was August 14, 2018, in Naperville, Illinois. The afternoon sun was still high when the production vans pulled up along the quiet suburban street. crew members unloading camera rigs and running cables through the front door of the newly renovated home. The final reveal was being broadcast live. Evan Cole, 34, was a camera operator for a home makeover production company. He had spent years on renovation shoots, moving through tight spaces and active construction zones without incident. That afternoon, he was positioned inside the house ahead of the host, ready to capture the tracking shots during the final reveal walkthrough. The live broadcast added pressure to keep the shoot moving without interruption. Those who worked with him noted he was disciplined with his positioning, keeping movements controlled and predictable, even in tight or active environments. What Evan did not know, and this is where it starts to get deeply uncomfortable, was that the wall removed during the renovation had not been non-load-bearing the way the production team had classified it. It had been providing partial structural support to the ceiling above the open living area. Temporary jack posts had been placed after the wall came down, but removed before the replacement beam was fully secured. The beam itself had been set in place, but not fully integrated into a continuous load path, with critical fasteners not yet installed, and one end lacking proper bearing support. No licensed structural engineer had signed off on the modification before filming resumed. As a result, the structure had been carrying load without adequate support for days, with weight partially redistributed across elements not designed to sustain it. The decision to proceed had been made under production pressure, with the timeline taking priority over structural verification. During my research, I discovered that this was not a hidden problem. The people on that production knew the temporary supports had come out before the permanent beam was ready. They kept the schedule anyway. By the time filming began, the ceiling had already been under uneven stress. Drywall seams along the modified section had begun to separate, and fine cracks had formed along joint lines, indicating movement in the structure above. What gets me is that the signs were already there. The ceiling was telling people something was wrong. The warning signs were subtle enough to be mistaken for normal settling, and with a live audience watching, no one stopped to investigate them. As the walkthrough began, Evan moved slowly backward through the open living area, carefully navigating cables and unfinished flooring, keeping the host in frame. His attention remained fixed on maintaining composition and stability. Faint creaking came from the joints overhead. Small particles of dust fell from the ceiling, and this is the part I find hardest to sit with. By this point, it was already too late. The structure had already entered a critical state, with remaining supports carrying loads beyond their intended capacity, and no margin left for stability. The ceiling above the modified span failed at one connection point first, then propagated across the unsupported section. The partially installed beam and unsupported joists dropped into the collapse zone where Evan was standing. The impact caused severe blunt force trauma to his head, neck, and upper body. He sustained a traumatic brain injury, multiple spinal fractures, and crush injuries to his chest. He was unconscious when the debris settled. The live feed cut abruptly, though viewers briefly saw the collapse before the broadcast was terminated. Crew members outside called emergency services immediately. Fire responders arrived within several minutes, securing the scene and checking for secondary collapse risk before making entry. Evan was found unresponsive beneath the debris. Despite emergency intervention at a nearby trauma center, his injuries were not survivable. Evan Cole was pronounced dead that evening. Structural inspectors and engineers later confirmed the wall had been misclassified and the temporary supports removed before the permanent beam was secured. No structural sign-off had been obtained before the space was cleared for filming. The production company had proceeded with a live broadcast in a structurally compromised space on a timeline that did not allow the work to be properly completed. And the part that I find hardest to sit with is that Evan Cole had no reason to question any of it. Cole had simply shown up to do his job. He never went home. It was April 10th, 2017, on a live comedy broadcast stage in Osaka, Japan, where a man who had spent years learning to make people laugh walked onto a platform that nobody had properly tested, and the last sound the studio audience heard from him was not a punchline. Hiroto Nishimura was 28 years old and worked as a stage actor with a regional theater company in Osaka. He had been performing since his early 20s, mostly in comedic ensemble roles. Outside his main work, He ran a small independent comedy collective with 3 friends and had been planning their first full production for months. He had joined the variety program specifically for the appearance fee, which friends said he intended to put toward venue rental costs. Unfortunately, that was the whole reason he was there. He was known on set for almost never refusing a physical bit. Directors who had worked with him described him as a yes person, the one who took the falls, wore the awkward costumes, stayed for the late reshoot. A production assistant who had worked with him on a prior segment told investigators Hiroto had a tendency to wave off safety briefings, not from carelessness exactly, but from a genuine trust in production crews. That morning, a crew member told him directly to test the platform before stepping onto it. Based on what I've read, it's not sure if he acknowledged it or not. What I do know is that the recording stage was an indoor studio facility in central Osaka. The segment was built around a tremor simulation gag, using a motorized platform designed to tilt subtly beneath a contestant while pre-recorded earthquake audio played through the speakers. Investigators later determined the motor had been misaligned during assembly the previous day, causing the platform to tilt at approximately 18 degrees at peak movement, more than 4 times the intended range. A camerawoman named Keiko had noticed a slight shift in the support frame during a pre-show run-through, but assumed it was deliberate. About 40 seconds before recording officially began, the stage manager called for a hold. The floor director acknowledged it, but failed to immediately and clearly relay the stop to the talent area, which would be required in a real production. Hiroto stepped onto the center of the platform, still smiling. The audience built into cheers around him. 2 crew members near the motor housing later said they knew something was wrong, but nobody stopped filming. At this point, I'm looking at what I'm reading and screaming internally. Why would they not stop? The motor engaged. The platform reached its maximum tilt in approximately 1.1 seconds. Hiroto's right foot lost contact with the surface first. His body weight dropped forward over his left knee, and when that foot slid too, there was some reflexive flailing of his arms, but not enough to regain balance. He went down face first. His forehead struck the concrete lip at the platform's front edge, where the rubber safety mat had been cut short during installation, leaving roughly 4 inches of bare concrete exposed. The impact was audible on the studio recording. Hiroto did not move after the impact. A production assistant near the camera bay described a spreading dark stain that reached the platform edge within seconds. Keiko reacted immediately to the fall, but had a brief moment of hesitation as the scene unfolded, filming for approximately 2 to 3 seconds before lowering her camera. 2 cast members rushed onto the platform. One knelt beside Hiroto and checked his airway. A second called emergency services from the stage floor. The control room switched the broadcast to a static card within seconds. Emergency responders arrived in 6 minutes. Hiroto was transported immediately and declared dead before reaching the hospital. The coroner determined cause of death to be severe traumatic brain injury from blunt force impact to the frontal skull. Hiroto's comedy collective held a quiet memorial at their studio the following week and suspended all activity for a month. His family filed a legal claim against the production company, citing the misaligned motor, the unprotected concrete edge, and the failure to halt recording after the stage manager's call. The court ultimately found partial liability, acknowledging that while Hiroto had been verbally advised to test the platform, production safety oversights contributed to the accident, and a settlement was reached rather than a full exoneration of the company. That ruling sits badly with me. Warning someone once and then allowing filming to continue while crew members are already exchanging looks about a malfunctioning motor. That is not an assumption of risk. That is a room full of people who made a choice to keep going. It was February 14th, 2015, on a temporary ice road spanning the Red Lake River Basin near Red Lake Falls, Minnesota. The morning was clear and cold, routine on the surface. Trucks idled in line as checks wrapped early. A live broadcast filmed preparations while winter weakened what seemed solid. Alexei Morozov was 36, an independent freight driver based in northwestern Minnesota, with more than a decade of winter hauling behind him. He owned his truck, an aging sleeper cab he kept running through careful maintenance and long hours. Alexei was known among brokers as cautious and slow to argue, someone who double-checked routes and declined work when conditions felt wrong. That winter, financial pressure influenced his decision to accept late-season work. A family medical expense had depleted his savings, limiting his ability to decline hazardous contracts. A regional television network partnered with a freight broker to cover late-season ice hauling during a live winter special. The focus was logistics, not spectacle. and Alexei was hired as a contract driver with hazard pay for one crossing. He was told the road remained open under reduced axle limits and speed restrictions after recent cold nights. He understood ice roads require sustained freezes, and that repeated thaw cycles had weakened the surface through uneven layers and subsurface erosion below. As the truck rolled onto the ice road, the live broadcast followed from a fixed camera on the riverbank, framed wide to show the full crossing. From that distance, viewers could see uneven color beneath the tires, dark patches where refrozen meltwater thinned the surface. Wind swept loose snow across the road, briefly masking long, faint lines in the ice. Near the midpoint, the failure became unmistakable on screen. The truck's headlights dipped sharply, and a dark crack split outward from beneath the front axle, visible even from the wide shot. A loud crack cut through the ambient audio. The cab lurched forward as the ice broke open, and black water surged up around the front wheels. The camera operator reacted late, the image shaking as the lens tried to zoom. Within seconds, the fracture widened. The truck tilted sideways, lifted slightly as the rear axle shifted, then dropped again as the ice collapsed under the trailer's weight. Water climbed rapidly along the doors. One headlight vanished, then the other. The image blurred as the camera lost focus, and the live feed cut abruptly, leaving only a rippling black gap in the ice where the truck had been moments earlier. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Rescue teams arrived about 18 minutes later, delayed by distance and unstable ice. By then, the surface had sealed, leaving faint bubbles beneath darkened patches. Divers recovered the cab hours later, after reinforcing the ice and cutting an access opening. That evening, the network returned live to confirm the death and suspend operations. The medical examiner ruled drowning, with cold shock contributing. Flooding triggered an involuntary gasp, drawing water into his lungs. Near freezing temperatures caused rapid muscle failure, preventing escape. No fractures or major internal injuries were found. Loss of consciousness would have followed quickly. The segment was pulled before rebroadcast. Public response led to stricter limits on late-season ice road filming and live coverage. The ice road was formally closed by county officials the following morning. It was March 9th, 2017 in Wichita, Kansas. The kind of late winter day where the sky stayed flat and gray from morning to afternoon, the air cold enough to keep most people inside. Nothing about the day stood out. No unusual weather, no reason for anyone to remember it, except for what happened inside a residential garage on the east side of the city. Jackson Gort was 21 years old. He worked nights at a grocery store, stocking shelves after closing, the kind of job that left you tired by morning and restless by afternoon. He wasn't the type to sit still. Friends described him as someone who always needed something going on, always chasing the next idea, the next reaction, the next thing that might get people talking. He had a small online presence, around 4,200 followers on a shock challenge page he ran out of the garage of the house he shared with two roommates. It wasn't fame, but it was enough to keep pushing. His roommate Tyler was 22, the one who usually held the camera. The two of them had been putting out videos for a while, dumb dares, gross out challenges, the kind of content that got a few hundred views if you were lucky, and lately, that's exactly what they were getting, a few hundred. Jackson had been frustrated about it. He felt like they needed to go further, do something that would actually make people stop scrolling. He kept saying they needed something extreme, something that could finally go viral, and that belief drove the next decision. Tyler suggested using a live feeder animal. They had both seen similar clips online, and the idea seemed simple enough. That same day, they went to a flea market and bought a small live feeder rat from a vendor selling reptile supplies. Jackson decided the video would look more authentic if the animal were alive rather than cooked. That detail mattered to him. He wanted it to feel real. They set up in the garage, a tripod on a workbench, a bright shop light aimed at a folding table, a camera pointed at the open space in front of it. The setup was basic, but functional. Jackson told the camera what he was about to do. Swallow the rat whole, no cuts, no stopping the recording. Tyler hit record and stepped back. Jackson held the rat by its tail over the table. The animal reacted immediately, twisting and biting his thumb hard enough to make him pull back. He grabbed it again. He pushed the rat's head toward his mouth, still talking to the camera as it twisted in his grip. The rat clawed at his lips as he forced it further in. To me, that moment, when the rat first bit him and he grabbed it again anyway, is the part that's hardest to sit with, because that was the last real chance he had to just stop. The moment it stopped looking like a stunt and started looking dangerous happened fast. He tilted his head head back and tried to force the rat into his mouth. As he pushed it past his gag reflex, the animal thrashed violently, and within seconds it became lodged in his throat, blocking his airway before he could react. He started choking immediately, bending forward and grabbing at his neck as panic set in. He tried to reach into his mouth to pull it out, but couldn't get a grip, gagging and struggling for air as the obstruction slipped deeper with each attempt. Tyler put the camera down and tried to help, reaching in as far as he could, but he couldn't reach far enough to get a hold of it. Jackson dropped to his knees on the concrete floor. Within a few minutes, his movements slowed, then stopped completely. Tyler called emergency services. Paramedics arrived and worked to remove the rat from Jackson's airway. Despite their efforts, he was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 21 years old. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation due to airway obstruction. Investigators noted the camera had been recording the entire time and was still running when officers entered the garage. The rat and the camera were both collected as part of the report. There were no other witnesses beyond Tyler whose account matched what the footage showed. What the report couldn't capture, and what I keep coming back to, is how ordinary the setup was. A garage, a shop light, a camera on a tripod. Jackson wasn't reckless in the way people imagine. He was someone who wanted more views and kept pushing the line a little further each time until one afternoon the line wasn't there anymore. The channel never posted another video. It was January 2018 in Clearwater, Florida. The kitchen was ordinary. Afternoon light came through the window above the sink. The laundry detergent sat on the shelf where it always did. Alyssa Grant was 17. She had a modest following on her video account and posted regularly after school. She was the kind of person who liked being in on things, who paid attention to what was moving online, and felt the pull of participation before she could fully articulate why. Friends said Alyssa was the kind of person who paid close attention before she committed to anything. In early 2017, a challenge involving laundry detergent pods had begun spreading across social media platforms. Participants filmed themselves biting into the brightly colored packets and reacting to the contents. The pods contained a polyvinyl alcohol film filled with concentrated laundry detergent, chemicals designed to dissolve in water and break down grease and fabric deposits inside washing machines. Their bright colors and glossy finish had been engineered for brand recognition, not consumption. They were not food. They had never been designed to be handled the way the videos handled them. What the videos did not make clear was how many of them were staged. Some participants bit through the casing and immediately spat the contents out before the detergent reached the back of the throat. Others cut the recording at the moment of contact. The reactions looked genuine. The gasping, the recoiling, the exaggerated expressions, all of it read as real on a small screen. She had watched several of the videos more than once. She believed she understood how it worked. She set her phone against the fruit bowl on the counter and adjusted the angle. She took a pod from the container on the shelf and held it up for the camera. She looked at it for a moment. She laughed once, quietly, the way people do when they are about to do something they are not entirely sure about. Then she bit through the casing. The film dissolved faster than she anticipated. The detergent reached the back of her throat before she could react. Within minutes, she began showing signs of severe chemical poisoning. Her mother, in the next room, heard the sound of retching and came in immediately. She called 911 within seconds. Over the next 8 minutes, Alyssa's breathing became labored and her face grew pale. Paramedics arrived and began treatment in the kitchen before moving her to the ambulance. Alyssa was transported to the nearest hospital in critical condition. She died the following morning from complications caused by the ingested chemicals. In the months that followed, platform policies were updated to restrict challenge content of this kind. Manufacturers reformulated the pod casing to release a bitter taste on contact and added additional child-resistant packaging requirements. The changes came after hundreds of poison control cases had already been reported. It was July 2016, and the midday sky over Puget Sound in Seattle, Washington sat low and gray, the water moving steadily beneath the hull of the passenger ferry as the city's skyline held faint in the distance, and I still wonder why ordinary days like this always end with some bad news. Marina Hale was 41 years old and had been hosting live travel segments long enough that working outdoors in open conditions felt completely routine to her. She was composed on camera, comfortable with movement and ambient noise, and That afternoon, she stood at the outermost railing on the wake-facing side of the ferry, with open water directly behind her, and nothing between her and the sound. Colleagues described her as calm and self-assured on camera, someone who made live segments feel effortless no matter the conditions. And look, this was not an unusual setup. This was exactly the kind of shot travel segments are built around. She delivered her lines directly to the camera with the kind of practiced ease that comes from years of live work, her body slightly angled toward the lens while her back remained fully exposed to the water behind her. The camera was fixed, the shot was steady, and the segment was moving without interruption. The framing required her to remain aligned with the lens, limiting her awareness of activity occurring behind her, outside the camera's field of view. Float plane traffic was visible in the background throughout, which was normal for that part of the sound. Scheduled routes crossed the area regularly, and nobody on deck was watching the aircraft, because there was no reason to. Marina continued speaking, and the camera stayed locked on her as a float plane appeared in the background on what looked like a routine descending approach. And this is where everything changed. Within seconds, the descent shifted, the angle steepening and the alignment breaking away from a controlled glide path, and the aircraft hit the water not far behind the ferry at a shallow forward angle that sent a dense plume of spray upward and outward. Part of the aircraft's forward momentum carried through the impact, allowing debris to travel across the water's surface rather than stopping immediately. The debris field spread fast. Heavier components fragmented and moved outward along low trajectories, skipping across the water's surface while retaining part of their forward momentum from the impact. A dense fragment planed low across the surface toward the ferry. What gets me about this part is that Marina never had a single moment to react. She was mid-sentence, facing the camera with her back to the water, and the segment had not paused or shifted in any way that would have caused her to turn around. As the fragment reached the ferry's wake, the uneven surface disrupted its path and caused it to rise slightly above the waterline as it approached the vessel before striking her from behind with significant force. She dropped out of frame immediately without any movement preceding the fall. The camera stayed on the empty space where she had been standing. That detail alone is the one I cannot shake off. Voices off camera began reacting without yet understanding what had just happened. The live feed continued for several seconds as confusion spread across the deck, and crew members moved without a clear picture of the cause. The director cut the broadcast and returned to the studio. Emergency response vessels were dispatched to both the crash site and the ferry as authorities worked to account for everyone involved. Marina Hale was confirmed dead from injuries caused by direct impact with aircraft debris, along with the occupants of the float plane. Investigators reviewed the footage, which had captured both the aircraft's water impact and the immediate sequence aboard the ferry in real time, making it one of the clearest recorded accounts of how quickly debris from a low-angle water impact can travel and the distance it can cover before losing velocity. Analysis of the footage confirmed that the debris retained sufficient kinetic energy over distance to remain hazardous beyond the immediate impact zone, and the thing that stays with me about Marina Hale is that there was nothing she could have done differently, not one thing. It was March 15, 2018, and a severe convective system had been tightening over Greater São Paulo since late morning. By early afternoon, the hill where Aldrich Mendes would stand held a view of the whole approaching system, and from inside the broadcast station 4 miles away, that view was the point. Aldrich was 29 years old and had spent 4 years as a field meteorology correspondent for a regional broadcast station in São Paulo. His reputation among colleagues was specific: meticulous with preparation, reckless with exposure. He reviewed radar loops before every assignment, taped his microphone connections personally, and kept a laminated wind speed reference card in his jacket pocket. He was also known for treating safety advisories as negotiable when the story was worth it. 6 months earlier, he had completed an annual lightning safety refresher covering exposure reduction, elevated position avoidance, and minimum crew distance from metal equipment during active lightning. He signed the acknowledgement form. That morning, producers urged an outdoor live segment to maximize viewership during the storm's peak window. Aldrich chose a small hill on the city's outskirts, roughly 20 feet above the surrounding terrain, and by 2:40 p.m. was standing on it holding a metal core microphone. Live cable running across wet grass toward Theo, his cameraman, 30 feet back. It's like watching someone knowingly step into a checklist of hazards. Thunder was cycling every 9 seconds by 2:47 p.m. Wind gusts had reached 35 miles per hour. A single small grounding rod had been set near the broadcast position, but it did not create a safe zone around Aldrich. He was within 4 feet of it, too close for any real protection. He was mid-segment, live on the broadcast feed, when a ground flash struck a chain-link fence 60 feet below at the hill's base, sending lateral current through the saturated soil and nearby wet grass, which reached the live cable running up the hillside. I find it difficult to move through this story without thinking about how many people in that production chain had the authority to pull him off that hill and chose not to. The current entered through the wet cable at the microphone connector. Theo saw the microphone jump violently in Aldrich's grip, a single rigid vibration, before sparks jumped from the cable connector at his feet. The physicality of this moment is what makes it so jarring for me. It's not gradual, not something that escalates, just one instant where everything changes with no chance to react. Muscles in Aldrich's body contracted uncontrollably from the current. His back arched hard, his right arm extended outward at an angle that was not voluntary. He cleared the ground by several inches before dropping onto his left side in the wet grass. His jacket was smoking at the collar and along the right forearm seam. The grip tape on the microphone handle had burned through at both contact points. Theo dropped the camera and ran toward him as the surge and Aldrich's collapse remained visible on the live broadcast for a brief moment before the feed cut. As he reached Aldrich, Theo felt a brief, sharp shock through the camera body from the voltage spike traveling in the cable, which caused his hands to tingle. He managed to drag Aldrich 3 feet before stopping, unable to continue. The burn marks in the grass were irregular, consistent with the chaotic path of a conduction-mediated lightning strike rather than a straight line. His right shoe had partially separated at the sole, consistent with the exit burn at the left heel documented later by the medical examiner. He did not move again. A pedestrian on the road below called emergency services within 30 seconds of the strike. A second bystander joined the call. Paramedics arrived approximately 10 minutes later and initiated resuscitation at the scene. Aldrich was pronounced dead at 3:14 p.m. The medical examiner determined cause of death to be cardiac arrest secondary to an indirect lightning strike conducted through wet equipment and soil. Entry burns were noted at the right hand, exit burns at the left heel. Cardiac tissue showed non-specific signs of electrothermal damage. No blunt trauma injuries were identified. The exposure was classified as conduction-mediated rather than direct strike. The station aired a brief statement that evening. Journalists struck during storm coverage and pulled the broadcast footage from its archive without public explanation. Colleagues left flowers at the hilltop the following morning. Staff were offered counseling sessions quietly, without announcement. I personally think that this wasn't a freak accident. It was a decision made inside an air-conditioned building by people watching the same radar Aldrich tracked for a living, who sent him up a hill anyway. It was August 7, 2016, at a temporary motocross circuit outside Seremban, Malaysia, where a regional sports channel aired the championship round live. The afternoon heat hung over the dirt track. Grandstands were packed, engines revved, and the broadcast opened on riders lining up beneath sponsor banners. Arif Rahman was 26 and a well-known rider within local motocross circuits. He wasn't famous nationally, but locally he mattered. He grew up riding on palm oil service roads, worked weekdays at his uncle's motorcycle shop, and raced every weekend he could afford tires. Regular spectators recognized his number from regional events. He was known for clean landings, smooth throttle control, and taking risks only when the points justified it. The event was a freestyle-heavy format added to boost attendance. Riders were scored not just on lap time, but on aerial tricks performed over a widened tabletop jump near the main camera tower. The jump had been reshaped overnight to look bigger on television, with a steeper face and longer gap. Riders were warned that spacing would be tighter and timing critical. The heat made the dirt dry and loose, reducing traction on approach. Arif qualified well and entered the final run in 3rd place. He needed a high-difficulty trick to move up. He had practiced a no-hander variation during warm-ups, but only once on the rebuild jump. Track officials kept the program moving to stay within the broadcast window. There were no extended gaps between riders. Engines roared continuously, and dust hung in the air. As the final run began, the live coverage followed the jump from a fixed sideline angle. Arif accelerated cleanly and launched high, releasing both hands mid-air as planned. At the same moment, a rider behind him, misjudging the spacing, hit the jump too early. The second bike rose faster and lower, drifting offline. The collision happened in the air, fully visible in the broadcast frame. The front wheel of the second bike struck Arif across the torso and shoulder. The impact twisted his body sideways while both bikes continued forward. Arif lost grip and separated from his motorcycle. The second rider clipped him again as they fell, sending Arif rotating headfirst toward the landing zone. Arif hit the dirt with extreme force. His helmet struck first, snapping his neck forward before his body folded beneath him. The second bike landed on top of him, the rear wheel spinning briefly against his back before stalling. The sound cut through the crowd, metal, plastic, and a dull impact that did not resemble a normal crash. Arif was motionless in the churned soil as other riders braked hard to avoid him. Officials rushed onto the track. The broadcast shifted to a wide overhead view as medics reached Arif, who did not move. His helmet was cracked at the chin bar. Emergency services were called immediately, and the race was stopped. Medical crews attempting resuscitation before the broadcast briefly returned to confirm a serious accident and then ended early. Arif was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at a nearby hospital. The post-mortem report listed catastrophic head and cervical spine trauma, along with massive internal injuries caused by blunt force. The collision in midair had delivered energy equivalent to a high-speed road crash, with no chance for protective gear to absorb it. Loss of consciousness would have been immediate. An investigation found that the modified jump reduced safe separation between riders and that no enforced delay existed between freestyle attempts. No charges were filed. The second rider survived with broken ribs and a fractured arm. The event was canceled permanently the following year. The track was leveled within weeks. The broadcast footage is never replayed, but many in the crowd remember exactly where they were standing when the engine stopped. It was October 6, 2018, above Provo Canyon, Utah. Early October in the Wasatch Range is one of those stretches where the mountains look almost unreal, the aspens turning gold against dark ridgelines, the air thin and cool at elevation, the kind of day that pulls people outdoors, whether they have a plan or not. The launch point above the canyon was a grassy slope that dropped steeply toward a rocky valley below, with a clear view of the ridges to the south and the canyon floor far below. The area was known locally for paragliding. Most of the people who used it had training. Lennon Spoff didn't. He was 27, worked at a warehouse 5 days a week, and lived for the weekends. That's when he'd head into the mountains around Provo with a camera and come back with something to post. Hiking, climbing, scrambling up ridgelines, anything that looked good on a screen. He had about 4,100 followers, and while that number wasn't growing fast, it was enough to keep him motivated. People who knew him said he had a restless energy, the kind of person who measured a good weekend by whether he had footage worth uploading, something that could actually take off online. I think that's what makes this one hard for me. He wasn't reckless out of stupidity, he was reckless out of hunger. So when a friend offered to lend him an older paragliding wing and harness, Lennon didn't hesitate. He had never taken a single lesson, never launched, never even sat in a harness off the ground, but he had watched enough footage online to feel like he understood the basics, how to lay out the wing, run into the wind, pull the brake lines. That secondhand confidence is something I've seen in almost every case like this. Watching someone do something well on a screen can make you believe you understand it. You don't. 2 friends came with him to the launch point that afternoon. Wind had picked up since the morning but was still steady enough that experienced pilots were flying. Lennon strapped into the harness and mounted his phone to his chest. He wasn't just filming, he was live streaming it, letting his followers watch the whole thing happen in real time. That detail sticks with me because it meant what happened next had an audience that couldn't do anything to stop it. The live stream captured everything that followed, and the 2 friends on the ridge confirmed the sequence. Lennon ran downhill. The wing caught air and pulled him off the ground. For a moment, it looked right. Then the glider started tracking sideways instead of straight out over the canyon. He overcorrected and pulled one brake line too hard. The wing tilted. A gust caught the canopy unevenly and one side folded inward. Not a full collapse, but enough. The lift died on that side and the whole system dropped. There was no room to recover. He was only about 30 to 40 feet above the rocky slope below the launch, still close to the mountain, and gaining almost no altitude when the wing failed. He dropped onto exposed rock on the slope below the launch, striking hard and tumbling several feet before stopping. The wing settled over him a moment later. His friends scrambled down the trail. The live stream was still running. Viewers were still connected. By the time anyone reached him, he wasn't moving. There was nothing they could do. The fall was short, but the impact was enough. Rescue crews reached the site and confirmed Lenin Spoff was dead. He was 27 years old. The equipment was collected and inspected. The wing and harness were older, but showed no mechanical failure. Investigators determined the crash resulted from operator error during launch, an overcorrection on the brake lines combined with a wind gust stronger than he could handle. There was no record of Lenin ever receiving formal paragliding instruction. The phone was still recording when it was recovered from his chest. The live stream had captured the full sequence from launch to impact. Several viewers had already contacted emergency services before the two friends made the call. It was March 2020 in Millbrook, Alabama. The hallway of a mid-sized public school was long and fluorescent lit, lined with lockers. Adrian Cole was 18. He had a small but active social media following, mostly students from his school, but he cared about it. He posted regularly. He tracked his numbers. He understood that attention was a currency, and that he was still working out how to earn it. A short jumping prank had been circulating on social media for several weeks. It was simple. 3 people stand side by side. The person in the middle jumps, and the 2 on the outside kick his legs out simultaneously. The videos spread quickly. They were brief, repeatable, and visually immediate. In most of the clips, the fall lasted only a second or two before the person on the ground stood up laughing. The format required almost no setup and could be filmed anywhere. That simplicity made the trend easy to copy. Each new video encouraged another. His followers noticed the trend before he posted anything. Comments arrived asking when he was going to try it. A few tagged him in other videos. Some of them had already filmed their own versions with friends after school. Adrian paid attention to those comments the same way he tracked his view counts, looking for signs of what people wanted to see next. A student in his grade had already filmed a version in the school parking lot, but the footage was shaky, poorly framed, and the fall barely stayed in view. Adrian watched it several times. The fall happened partly outside the frame, and the camera moved as soon as the person hit the ground. It looked careless. He told a friend he could do it better. He believed this genuinely. He recruited 2 students from his class and explained the mechanics carefully. Timing mattered. If the kicks were uneven, the fall would look awkward instead of clean. They ran through the motion once without jumping, so everyone understood when to move. Adrian wanted it to look controlled. He chose the hallway near the lockers during the mid-morning break because the light was better there and the background was clean. Students moved past in small groups, opening lockers and talking over each other while they waited for the next bell. The noise of the hallway carried easily across the tile floor. He handed his phone to a 3rd student and gave brief instructions on framing. He wanted the full fall in frame. Adrian positioned himself between the 2 students, faced the camera, and nodded to indicate he was ready. When he jumped, both students kicked his legs out simultaneously. His body dropped backward onto the tile floor. He had no time to extend his arms before the back of his head made contact. The sound of the impact carried sharply across the hallway. He did not get up. A few nearby students had been watching, and the hallway fell quiet when he did not respond. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes after a teacher called 911. Adrian was conscious but unable to track movement or respond to questions. He was transported by ambulance to the nearest hospital, where imaging confirmed a severe traumatic brain injury. His condition deteriorated through the night as intracranial pressure increased. 2 days later, Adrian Cole died from complications related to the injury. The student holding the phone deleted the footage before the end of the school day. It was December 23, 2015, in a paved public square in central Cairo, Egypt. The afternoon sun flat and pale gold, the air carrying exhaust and roasted nuts, and where a man who had spent nearly a decade perfecting his craft bled out on a concrete stage in front of a live crowd in under 2 minutes. Radi Mansour was 31 years old and had worked as a street performer in Cairo since his early 20s, building a quiet but reliable reputation in the tourist corridors near the city's most visited landmarks. He specialized in bladed juggling, knives, cleavers, and most prominently, machetes, and had spent years refining a routine built around precise arc throws and timed catch sequences. I keep thinking how this isn't some reckless beginner. This is someone who practiced every day, which somehow makes what's coming feel worse. Local vendors who watched him regularly described him as obsessively consistent. He ran his full routine every morning before tourists arrived, adjusting spacing and timing until each pass was repeatable to the inch. He had performed at street festivals, private events, and cultural exhibitions across the city. What he had never done was perform under live broadcast conditions. 3 weeks before December 23rd, A regional production crew approached him about a short live segment for a local station's holiday coverage. The arrangement was simple: perform his standard routine, draw a crowd. One detail changed in the final production meeting. The low rope barrier he used to keep bystanders at a safe distance was not removed, but was instead repositioned about 6 feet back and slightly lowered to improve camera sightlines, which slightly reduced the protective space around him. The square that afternoon held roughly 60 tourists and local pedestrians in a loose semicircle around the performance area. A 40-foot stretch of uneven concrete slightly sloped toward a center drain. The surface had been patched several times over the years, and a raised seam ran across the stone roughly 4 feet from where Roddy typically planted his left foot during catch sequences. The routine started cleanly with the main broadcast camera fixed on him. Witnesses described the first several passes as controlled and precise. On the fourth sequence, Roddy shifted slightly to his right. His left heel caught the concrete seam, a minor slip that displaced him only an inch or two from his normal stance. The machete left his right hand on its upward arc. This small stance change altered the blade's trajectory enough that it came back lower and closer than he expected. Roddy extended his left arm to correct. His right hand crossed to intercept. The crew shouted from behind the camera cluster. He did not have time to redirect. I'm literally watching this like it's in slow motion, knowing it's just inches and seconds, deciding everything is honestly terrifying. The blade struck the right side of his neck at the base, just above the clavicle, the moment visible on the live broadcast for several seconds before the feed cut. It opened a deep wound approximately 4 inches across the side of the neck, severing the right external jugular vein and lacerating the right common carotid artery. He dropped straight to the pavement. No stagger, no catch. Blood reached the concrete in volume within seconds and spread across the uneven surface faster than anyone around him could process. It's so direct and clinical, but that almost makes it worse for me because there's no drama, just instant reality. A witness named Samir, standing near the front of the crowd, moved first. He pushed through the bystanders and pressed both hands against the wound. Tourists pulled back, several screaming. The production crew cut the live feed within approximately 20 seconds of the fall. Samir held pressure while someone called for an ambulance. A crew member placed the emergency call. Responders arrived 9 minutes later. He was transported to a regional medical facility and pronounced dead on arrival. The coroner's finding, in plain terms, acute hemorrhagic shock caused by laceration of the right carotid artery and jugular vein. Given the severity and location of the wound, there was no viable intervention window. Death resulted directly from exsanguination. The local station issued a brief line noting a performance accident. No extended coverage followed. Samir gave one account to investigators and declined to speak further. Roddy's family held a private funeral attended only by close relatives and a small number of fellow performers. Multiple tourists had recorded portions of the incident on their phones, but most footage remained private or unshared outside immediate circles. The production crew issued no public statement. It was September 6, 2018, on a downhill highway outside San Fernando City, Pampanga, where a regional TV station aired a live traffic report. As vehicles slowed near a busy junction, a cement truck lost its brakes. The broadcast cut moments after the reporter was struck. Ramon Villarreal was 39 and had worked as a regional TV reporter for over a decade. He was not a national face, but viewers recognized him from morning weather hits and roadside updates during storms. He preferred fieldwork to the studio. Reporting live meant standing where things were actually happening, even when it was loud, hot, or uncomfortable. That afternoon, he stood on the shoulder near a concrete barrier, microphone in hand, traffic moving steadily behind him. Ramon had started in radio, then moved to television when the station expanded its local coverage. His job was practical: describe conditions, keep drivers informed, and get out of the way. He wore a reflective vest over a pressed shirt, an earpiece feeding instructions from the control room. The camera was framed wide enough to show traffic flowing downhill behind him, including a construction corridor used heavily by freight trucks. The slope was long and gradual, easy to underestimate. At the bottom sat a signalized junction that forced heavy vehicles to slow. Brake fade was a known risk on hot days. Earlier that week, transport officials had issued reminders about engine braking on descents, but enforcement was light. Ramon mentioned the congestion calmly, pointing behind him as he explained delays and alternate routes. As the live segment continued, a cement truck appeared at the top of the frame, moving faster than surrounding traffic. Its drum was full, the weight evident in the way the cab bounced slightly as it descended. Viewers could see it closing in quickly. Ramon kept speaking, unaware of the speed difference behind him. Seconds later, the truck swerved. Its brake lights flickered, then went dark. The sound reached the microphone first, a rising mechanical whine followed by a deep, uncontrolled roar. On the live broadcast, the truck veered left, clipped a sedan, and jackknifed. The drum shifted violently, pulling the cab sideways. The camera caught everything. The truck struck the concrete barrier and tipped. Ramon turned instinctively toward the noise just as the cab rolled through the frame. The front corner hit him at full momentum, throwing him backward. His body was driven into the barrier and pinned as the truck collapsed onto its side. The impact was brutal. Bones shattered on contact. The force crushed his lower body against the concrete, rupturing internal organs instantly. Wet cement burst from a damaged chute, spilling across the pavement and over him as the truck ground to a halt. The camera shook, then froze on the scene as the control room cut the feed. Emergency services responded immediately, halting traffic. Ramon was found unresponsive, pinned beneath twisted metal and hardening concrete. Extraction took time. The driver survived, citing brake failure. Investigators confirmed brake overheating and missed maintenance. The medical examiner ruled catastrophic blunt force and crush injuries, with loss of consciousness and no chance survival. The station suspended live roadside reporting indefinitely. The footage was never aired again, though some viewers remembered seeing the moment the broadcast cut. The intersection was redesigned months later with a truck arrestor lane added uphill. Ramon left behind a partner and 2 young children. His last broadcast was meant to warn drivers about traffic. Instead, it became a reminder of how quickly routine coverage can turn irreversible when heavy machinery, speed, and gravity converge in real time. It was July 14, 2017, along the shoreline of Gulf Shores, Alabama. Midsummer on the Gulf Coast is exactly what you'd expect. The water warm and flat, the sand white enough to hurt your eyes without sunglasses, and the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the parking lot before you even reach the beach. By midday, the shore was dotted with umbrellas and coolers, families spread out across the sand, the usual summer scene. But that morning, lifeguards had posted warning flags along the beach. The reason was visible from the waterline. Jellyfish, large numbers of them, drifting in clusters just below the surface, close enough to shore that you could see them from the dry sand. Some were small and nearly transparent, others larger with long trailing tentacles moving slowly with the current. Soren Dwalt was 24. He drove a delivery route during the week, long hours behind the wheel with not much to show for it beyond a paycheck and sore shoulders. Weekends were when he felt like himself. He traveled when he could, usually short trips with friends, and filmed most of it for a small online following of about 3,900 people. Travel clips, challenge videos, the kind of content that lives or dies on whether something interesting actually happens. He was the type who said yes to things before thinking them through. That quality made him fun to be around. It also put him on this list. He had come to Gulf Shores with 2 friends for a few days of beach content. The trip was casual, no big plans, just sun and footage. When they saw the warning flags, Soren's reaction wasn't to leave, it was to stay. He told his friends that swimming through the jellyfish would make a better video than anything else they'd get that day, something that could actually take off. His friends set a phone on the sand pointed toward the water. Lifeguards had already told people to stay out until the jellyfish moved on, and several swimmers had turned back after seeing the clusters near shore. A few people standing near the flags even warned him it wasn't worth it. This one stands out because the danger wasn't hidden. It was floating in plain sight, marked with warning flags along the beach. This one sticks with me more than the others. He didn't misjudge the risk. He knew the warning and chose to ignore it because the footage mattered more to him. That's the kind of math I don't think I'll ever understand. Soren saw all of it and walked into the water anyway, wearing nothing but swim trunks. What happened next was witnessed by his friends and several people nearby. Soren waded in and swam toward a visible cluster near the surface. Within seconds, tentacles made contact with his arms and chest. He shouted and tried to push them away, but the more he moved, the more tentacles touched him. As he turned back toward shore, more tentacles wrapped across his neck, back, and shoulders. The stings were piling up fast. His strokes became uneven, then weak. His friends ran into the shallow water to reach him. They dragged him onto the beach. Red welts covered most of his upper body. He was breathing hard and shaking, then his breathing turned shallow and uneven. Witnesses said he looked disoriented and struggled to breathe, consistent with a severe reaction to multiple stings, possibly allergic in nature. A small wave rolled over him while he was collapsing in the shallows before his friends pulled him fully onto the sand. He stopped responding. Lifeguards reached him within moments and began treatment. His pulse became irregular, and responders noted signs of a severe systemic reaction following multiple stings affecting his chest, neck, and arms. Oxygen and emergency medication were attempted on the beach, but his condition kept worsening. Emergency crews took over and transported him to the hospital. He went into cardiac arrest during transport after the reaction worsened, following the repeated stings and water inhalation. Soren Dwalt was pronounced dead at the hospital. He was 24. The official findings listed the cause of death as cardiac arrest following a severe systemic reaction to multiple jellyfish stings, complicated by water inhalation during the incident. Investigators confirmed warning flags had been posted and beachgoers told to stay out of the water. The phone his friends set up on the sand was still recording when responders arrived. What investigators could not confirm was whether Soren had a pre-existing allergy or whether the number of stings alone triggered the reaction. What they did confirm was that the stings were extensive and that once the reaction started, his condition deteriorated in only a few minutes despite rapid response from lifeguards and paramedics. It was June 21st, 2018, in the highland interior of Iceland. The canyon was narrow and basalt-walled, carved by centuries of water through volcanic rock. There were no trail markers, no signs, and no footprints beyond her own. At the end of the canyon, a waterfall dropped into a dark pool before continuing downstream. Cassie Rowan was 24 and worked remotely as a graphic designer. The freedom allowed her to travel frequently, and she had spent 2 years building a travel account focused on remote locations. Her content centered on finding places few creators had photographed. For 3 weeks, she had been traveling through Iceland. After covering much of the southern coastline, she began moving inland toward more remote terrain. The canyon came from a suggestion offered by a local guide she met near Vik. It was not listed on common travel maps, and there was no formal trail leading to it. Cassie reached it after hiking for nearly 2 hours across uneven ground. When the canyon opened in front of her, she immediately understood why it had rarely appeared online. The waterfall was partially hidden by the rock walls, and the light inside the canyon changed quickly depending on the angle of the sun. For creators trying to post something new, the challenge was not only reaching places like this, but capturing an image from an angle few others had attempted. A narrow rock shelf ran beside the falls, wide enough to stand on but close enough to frame the waterfall. Cassie tested the footing and checked the angle, but the afternoon light was wrong. She left the canyon planning to return early the next morning. Overnight, steady rain moved across the highlands. Cassie returned to the canyon shortly before 8 the next morning. She carried the same tripod and camera she had used the day before and positioned them facing the waterfall. The rock shelf looked unchanged, but basalt absorbs and holds moisture differently than many other types of stone. The surface that had felt stable the previous afternoon was now coated in a thin film of water. She stepped onto the ledge and adjusted the frame through the camera. The tripod remained positioned near the edge of the canyon floor, recording the scene. Cassie shifted her footing and moved slightly left to correct the angle. The camera captured her stepping forward and repositioning herself on the narrow shelf. A moment later, she slipped out of frame and into the pool below the falls. The tripod remained where she had placed it, and the camera continued recording the waterfall until the battery failed. When Cassie did not return to her guest house that evening, the owner contacted the local emergency line. Her rental car was discovered the following morning parked near the gravel road that led toward the canyon. Search and rescue teams followed the trail on foot and reached the waterfall by mid-morning. The tripod was still positioned near the edge of the canyon floor. Investigators reviewed the camera recording at the site to determine what had happened and to confirm that Cassie had been alone. The footage showed her stepping onto the rock shelf, adjusting her position, and disappearing from view. Search teams located her body downstream later that afternoon. Cassie Rowan was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as drowning following an accidental fall from the ledge beside the waterfall.
It was September 9th, 2019, at an indoor arena hosting a regional kennel club show in Cincinnati, Ohio. Multiple rings were active across the floor, handlers moving their dogs through judging passes, while the audience sat close to the action. Broadcast cameras moved between rings, and a commentary team covered each breed category from ringside positions. Graham Wells was 39 years old and had been doing ringside commentary for 6 years. He was comfortable in the environment, good at reading a room, and the kind of broadcaster who made the work look effortless. His job was to describe what was happening in the ring for viewers at home, keep the energy up between judging phases, and occasionally interact with handlers during breaks. He was also the kind of person who did more than the minimum. Colleagues had mentioned it. He had a habit of getting close to the action because he believed the audience deserved to feel like they were there. The Belgian Malinois in the ring that morning was a high-drive working dog from working line stock, known for its speed, focus, and sensitivity to sudden movement. Show conditioning allows these dogs to perform in public settings, but their reactions can still be sharp under certain conditions. The handler was experienced, and the dog was under control. The ring was separated from the commentary area by a low rope boundary, with a small buffer space typically kept clear between handlers and media. Graham stepped slightly closer to the boundary during the coverage as the handler brought the dog near the edge following a judging pass. It was the kind of move he had made dozens of times before. The dog was alert and focused. A nearby camera shifted position abruptly, creating a sudden movement in the dog's peripheral vision. The dog's attention shifted immediately. Graham, still on air and maintaining his commentary, reached forward into the dog's space toward its head without a cue from the handler. The dog reacted to the combined stimulus of the sudden movement and the reach into its space. The sudden bite and his reaction to it pulled Graham off balance. His footing shifted at the boundary between the ring mat and the exposed hard floor, and he went down at the edge of the ring. The handler moved to regain control immediately, but the initial bite and pull sequence had completed before additional control could be fully applied. Graham collapsed at ringside. The fall drove a severe impact into his head and upper body as he hit the hard floor at the edge of the ring. On the broadcast, the audio broke and the camera shifted away from the ring within seconds. The audience near the ring reacted as staff moved in immediately. Medical staff were on the floor and reached him within seconds. The bite had caused significant soft tissue injury to his hand and forearm. The fall itself drove the primary trauma, a severe impact to his head and upper body against the hard floor at the ring boundary. Emergency services were contacted and paramedics arrived within minutes. Despite immediate response and sustained effort, Graham Wells was pronounced dead at the arena. The cause of death was recorded as fatal traumatic head and upper body injury following a fall precipitated by an animal bite. The bite initiated the loss of balance. The floor did the rest. The review found that only a low rope separated the commentary area from the ring, that Graham had stepped into the buffer zone and reached toward the dog without a handler cue, and that a sudden stimulus triggered the reaction. Graham had done this for years. He knew those rings, but in one moment, one reach without a cue, the situation changed completely and permanently. Experience is not the same as immunity. That is the sentence I would write under every single case in this video if I could.
It was March 2014 in the ballroom of a downtown Chicago hotel. Around 95 guests were seated at round tables facing a temporary stage with tight theatrical lighting. The event had been selected as a feature segment for a local cable show that covered entertainment events across the city. Lena Voss was 34 years old and had worked as a professional magician's assistant long enough that positioning herself inside mechanical stage apparatus was as routine to her as any other part of the job. She understood the equipment, understood what exact alignment inside it required, and trusted both the machinery and the operator controlling it the way you have to, when the act depends on both working perfectly at the same time. And that word, trust, is the one that keeps coming back to me with this story. However, people who worked with her said she was careful and precise, someone who followed each step the same way every time. She was used to working inside tight spaces and relied on the equipment to function as expected. Guests were seated and watching quietly, focused on the stage as the show moved from one act to the next. The illusion that evening involved a horizontal cabinet fitted with a motorized sliding tray system. The tray was designed to retract her body laterally away from the path of a descending circular saw blade at the critical moment of the performance, creating the illusion of the blade passing through her while she had already been moved clear of its path. Backstage, she prepared as usual, calm and familiar with every step of the sequence. She entered the apparatus, positioned herself flat along the tray, held the required posture, and waited for the performance to begin. Compared to every other incident I talk about, this one stands out. There were no warning signs before the act started. The equipment appeared to be working the same way it always had. The act opened as rehearsed, with lighting and music timed to mask the mechanical movement inside the cabinet and hold the audience's attention on the exterior of the apparatus. At the critical moment, the tray was triggered to retract along its track, and this is where everything that was supposed to protect her quietly stopped working. A worn drive gear in the tray's motor assembly slipped under load, causing the tray to stall short of its full travel distance and leaving part of Lena's body outside the safe clearance zone the retraction was designed to create. The movement stopped just short of where it needed to be. The difference was small, but it was enough to leave her in danger. From the operator's position, stage lighting glare, the angle of the enclosure, and the cabinet housing obscuring the lower alignment line made the misalignment appear minor, consistent with what he had previously seen as acceptable alignment during rehearsals. What gets me is that he genuinely could not tell. The system gave him nothing. There was no position sensor confirming full retraction and no interlock preventing blade activation unless the tray reached its end position. Then the operator triggered the saw's descent on cue, and the rotating blade made contact with Lena's midsection, cutting through tissue and causing immediate and severe abdominal injury. The cabinet concealed the full extent of what was happening from the audience for only a moment before the performance broke down visibly. The sound and the sudden halt of the act making clear to everyone in the room that something had gone wrong. The live broadcast captured it in full before anyone could cut the feed. I have read a lot of these cases, and this is majorly disturbing. I wonder how the audience slept that night. The performance halted immediately as the deviation became visible and stage crew moved in from both sides. At first, some people in the audience were unsure what they were seeing. Then it became clear that something had gone seriously wrong. Emergency services were called, and Lena was removed from the apparatus and transported to a nearby hospital where she underwent emergency surgery. She died approximately 4 hours later. Investigators found the accident resulted from a worn drive gear slipping under load within the sliding tray system, compounded by the absence of a position sensor confirming full retraction and no interlock preventing blade activation unless the tray reached its end position. And the part I find disturbing was how entirely preventable it was. One sensor, one interlock. Lena Voss would have gone home. She was just 34 years old. The failure came from more than one problem, but each one could have been prevented. Small safety checks could have stopped the sequence before it reached that point. I actually spent 3 hours going back through stage illusion accident records trying to find a comparable case, and I couldn't find one that documented this clearly. What a tragic way to die. It was October 3rd, 2017. Inside a broadcast production studio in Manila, Philippines, where a fire act that had been performed hundreds of times without incident was about to find the one condition that made all that experience irrelevant. Renato Dalisay was 34 years old and had worked Manila's small performance circuit for nearly a decade. Outdoor festivals, private events, tourist district showcases. Fellow performers described him as someone who drilled his technique until it was automatic. He had built a specific reputation for fire acts, and the televised talent competition was the largest platform he had ever booked. Reading this, I can't help but think how this is exactly the kind of moment people wait years for. Fire breathing leaves almost no margin for error. A performer holds fuel in the mouth and blows it across a flame so it ignites in the air, not inside. He brought his own fuel. The production's fire safety coordinator had flagged this before rehearsal and directed him to use the stage-supplied compound, which met the venue's specifications. The key variable is the fuel. Stage-grade paraffin burns slowly and predictably, while volatile substitutes can ignite too fast. When that happens, flashback can occur, sending fire back toward the face instead of forming a controlled plume. Renato declined, telling crew his personal blend gave him more consistent flame behavior and that he had used it for years without incident. The coordinator explicitly refused to approve the act with personal fuel, but a producer overruled the hold and cleared the segment to proceed. The schedule was tight, and the segment went forward. I personally think years of nothing going wrong is one of the most dangerous forms of confidence a person can carry. I think it's frustrating in a very specific way, because the system meant to stop this actually did its job and was ignored. The studio floor was acrylic paneled, chosen for its reflective quality under broadcast lighting. Several crew members noted before the segment that performers in earlier slots had struggled for footing on it. The production team did not install temporary mats despite known slipperiness. 4 overhead lighting banks ran at full intensity. Smoke machines fed a thin haze across the lower third of the stage. A fire safety officer stood in the left wing with 2 extinguishers. The nearest seated judge was approximately 15 feet from the performance mark. Renato stepped to center stage, ignited his torch, loaded the fuel, and squared his stance. The preparation appeared routine to everyone watching, with the main broadcast camera locked on him. He angled the torch and expelled the liquid. The flame ignited in a sudden flashback. Instead of a smooth vertical column, a chaotic fireball erupted back toward his face, clearly visible on the live broadcast feed, with uneven tongues of flame licking outward. His cheeks and mouth caught fire almost instantly, and small sparks splashed across the margins of his eyelids and periorbital area. The torch dropped. His knees gave and he went straight to the stage floor. The acrylic surface offered no grip. Crew in the wings had already begun moving before he landed. A fire blanket was placed over him within seconds. 2 extinguishers discharged across the stage as the control room cut the broadcast away from the performance. The fire on his clothing was controlled quickly, but the inhalation damage had already occurred. His breathing was audible from the wing, labored, deteriorating, accompanied by continuous coughing. I find it almost unbearable that people were already moving toward him and still couldn't close the gap in time. A producer on the stage floor called emergency services immediately. Paramedics arrived in under 5 minutes. Renato's airway compromise was severe enough that paramedics needed immediate airway management once they arrived. He was transported to the hospital where acute respiratory failure developed despite intervention. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as acute respiratory failure secondary to severe inhalation burns, with full-thickness contact burns documented across the face, periorbital region, and anterior neck. The production company issued a brief statement. Renato's family held a small service in Manila, attended mostly by performers from the same circuit he had worked for a decade. His personal fuel container was recovered from his kit bag and returned to the family with his other belongings. I feel like there's something especially quiet and heavy about this ending. No spectacle, no extended coverage, just a small circle of people who actually knew him. It was December 31st, 2017, in Ilocos Sur, Philippines, near the old plaza where fireworks were set off every New Year's Eve. The streets followed a familiar rhythm of road closures, vendor stalls, and rehearsed countdowns. Around the square, aging houses with wooden balconies and concrete add-ons stood quietly above groups waiting for midnight. Paulo Rivera was 34, a sales coordinator for a regional construction supply distributor based in La Union. His job revolved around inventory tracking, delivery schedules, and keeping contractors satisfied before deadlines. He was single, routine-driven, and social only with a small circle of friends from work and college. That night, as a regional television station broadcast the city's New Year's Eve celebration live from the nearby plaza, Paulo joined friends at a house a few blocks away, an old 3-story structure inherited decades earlier and lightly renovated over time. The house belonged to a friend whose family had lived near the plaza since the 1970s. Like many old homes in the area, it had been expanded upward without modern reinforcement. The third-floor balcony was a narrow concrete extension, added years earlier for festival viewing. It was never designed to hold more than a few people at once. Paulo brought drinks, joked easily, and stayed near the railing to watch fireworks without forcing his way through the crowd below. As the evening went on, more friends arrived. Music played, and people drifted toward the balcony to get a clear view of the plaza, the same stretch of street where a regional television station had positioned a fixed wide-angle camera at the edge of the plaza, framing the crowd, fireworks launch area, and the row of older houses behind them for the live countdown. Fireworks were already being staged, lighting the street in brief flashes. By 11:45 p.m., as everyone anticipated the fireworks display, the balcony held more people than it was meant to support. As several people leaned forward together to see the first fireworks ignite, weight shifted toward the outer edge. Fine cracks near the base went unnoticed, hidden by layers of paint and shadow. At 11:59 p.m., as the live broadcast counted down the final seconds of the year, fireworks ignited above the plaza. The camera held its wide shot. In the background, just above the crowd line, the third-floor balcony shifted. A visible crack ran across the slab, and within seconds, the outer edge dropped. The collapse unfolded fully within the frame as the concrete tore away from the wall. 3 figures were carried down with the falling slab. Paolo struck a lower awning, rotated, and hit the pavement head first. The 2 others fell at a shallower angle, striking the ground feet first and absorbing the impact through their lower limbs. The camera remained live for several seconds as people scattered beneath the falling debris, before the feed abruptly cut away. Emergency services were called immediately. Police and medics arrived within minutes. Paolo showed no signs of life, blood mixed with broken concrete and firework debris along the roadside, as authorities secured the area and halted the celebration below. The 2 other individuals were found alive but critically injured and were transported to a nearby hospital. The medical examiner later reported that Paolo died from catastrophic head and neck trauma. The injuries were immediately fatal, with no chance of consciousness after impact. Toxicology tests were negative. Shortly after midnight, the regional television broadcast returned live, no longer focused on fireworks, but on flashing lights, cordoned streets, and officials redirecting crowds. The house was declared unsafe and partially demolished weeks later. City officials ordered inspections of nearby old structures around the plaza. It was June 18, 2016, at a public picnic area near a lake outside Tampa, Florida. Mid-June in that part of the state means humidity that settles on your skin the moment you step outside, the kind of afternoon where the air feels heavy and the grass stays damp even without rain. The picnic area was a flat, open stretch of lawn bordered by trees on one side and the lake on the other. Quiet that day, a few people nearby with enough open space to set up a camera without anything getting in the way. Kylie Vane was 23 years old. She worked part-time at a clothing store, the kind of retail job that keeps you on your feet and leaves your evenings free. She was outgoing and comfortable in front of a camera. Friends described her as someone who lit up when people were watching, someone who leaned into attention rather than away from it. She had been posting short challenge videos online and had built a following of around 3,800 people. The numbers had been soft lately, and Kylie wanted to do something bigger, something that could actually take off. Her friend Dylan was 24 and worked at a small local pet shop. He wasn't a trained handler, but he had just enough exposure to exotic animals to feel comfortable around them. When Kylie said she wanted something more dangerous, Dylan mentioned a boa constrictor left at the shop temporarily by a customer. The snake was around 9 feet long and hadn't been handled much. Dylan told her it could tighten if it got stressed. Kylie understood that and decided to go ahead anyway. The plan was simple: wear the snake around her neck, address the camera, keep it short. They chose the picnic area for the outdoor background. A tripod was set up on the grass in front of her, and a small group of bystanders were close enough to see what was happening. I want to pause here because Dylan did warn her before they started, and she still went ahead. I'm not saying that to judge her. I think most people convince themselves the warning is just a precaution, that it won't actually happen to them. But that warning is what makes this case so difficult to sit with. Dylan placed the snake over Kylie's shoulders. The animal began moving almost immediately, looping its body around her neck and upper chest. Kylie tried to keep talking to the camera while the coils settled. Then the snake wrapped another loop around her ribs and began pulling tighter. Boa constrictors don't attack. They respond to pressure and movement by constricting further. It's a reflex, not aggression. The more Kylie shifted and tried to lift the coils, the more the animal tightened. Dylan tried to unwind the snake from the outside, but the animal pulled closer. Kylie fell backward onto the grass. The coils pressed against her chest and neck simultaneously. Witnesses heard shouting and moved toward her. Dylan kept working at the snake, and they tried to unwind it but couldn't loosen the coils. Kylie stopped moving while the snake continued tightening around her torso. The pressure around her ribs made it harder for her to breathe, and over the next few minutes her movement slowed, then stopped completely. I think what haunts me most about this particular moment is that everyone around her was trying, hands grabbing at the coils, people shouting, and none of it was enough, which is a kind of helplessness I hope I never have to experience. The coils finally loosened only after several people pulled the snake free together. By that point, Kylie was not responding. CPR was started while emergency services were called. Paramedics arrived and continued resuscitation efforts on the grass before transporting her to the hospital. Kylie Vane was later pronounced dead. She was 23 years old. The official cause of death was listed as respiratory compromise due to chest compression, consistent with constriction by a large snake. Investigators reviewed the footage from the camera, which had been recording throughout. The snake was removed by animal control officers. The investigation concluded the animal's behavior was consistent with a stress response. The unfamiliar environment and movement were factors that would cause a boa constrictor to tighten instinctively. Authorities noted Dylan had no formal handling credentials and the snake had not been conditioned for that kind of contact. What stands out in Kylie's case is the warning. It wasn't hidden. It was clear and acknowledged, so why go ahead anyway? It was September 4th, 2022 in Columbus, Ohio. The apartment was small and the kitchen opened directly into the living room. The stove sat against the far wall, close enough to the couch that you could smell whatever was cooking from anywhere in the space. Kayla Morris was 24. She worked the morning shift as a dental receptionist downtown, a job she had held for 2 years and was known to be reliable at. Most evenings, she came home with enough energy left to cook, to scroll, and sometimes to film short videos on her phone. She had recently started posting online, nothing with a large following yet, but she was consistent and she paid attention to what worked. Those who knew her said she was the kind of person who committed fully once she decided on something. She did not do things halfway. Earlier that year, a video had begun circulating online that showed someone cooking a chicken breast in a pan filled with bright green NyQuil. The medicine was a common over-the-counter nighttime cold remedy. The video was framed as a recipe. It had a thumbnail. It had a title. The presentation carried the same casual domestic tone as any ordinary cooking video, the kind that made the process look simple and the result look worth trying. Kayla watched it late one evening while scrolling through her phone. The video was short and cut quickly between steps. No one explained the chemistry of what was happening in the pan. The comments underneath treated it like a joke or a challenge. She watched the video twice, then she thought about how she would film her own version. The next day, after work, she stopped at a store and bought a package of chicken breasts and a bottle of NyQuil. That evening, she cleared space on the counter and propped her phone upright against a glass so the camera faced the stove. She opened the recording app and tested the angle, stepping briefly into frame before returning behind the counter. When everything looked right, she pressed record. She placed a pan on the stove and poured the bright green liquid in. The color spread across the metal surface in a thin layer. She turned the burner on and waited. NyQuil contains several active compounds that are safe when taken as directed in measured liquid doses. Heating medications, however, can change how those ingredients behave. Some compounds may release vapors when heated, meaning they can be inhaled rather than processed slowly through the stomach. Kayla stood over the stove as the liquid began to simmer. The vapor rose slowly at first, thin and barely visible. As the heat increased, the smell spread through the small apartment. She leaned in slightly to check the pan. A few seconds passed. She coughed once, then again, sharper this time. She straightened and stepped back from the stove, blinking as her eyes watered. She reached for the counter to steady herself. Her legs did not hold. She collapsed, striking her head on the floor as she went down. A neighbor in the next apartment heard the impact through the wall and came to knock on the door. When there was no response, they called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes and forced entry into the apartment. The stove burner was still on and the pan continued to heat. One paramedic moved to turn off the burner while another knelt beside Kayla to check her breathing and pulse. She was placed on a stretcher and transported by ambulance to the nearest hospital. Kayla Morris was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later determined that she had suffered a fatal head injury when she struck the floor after collapsing beside the stove. The video was never posted.
It was April 18, 2018, at a restored Victorian estate in rural Virginia. The main hall had been prepared for a live auction broadcast. Rows of seated bidders facing a central podium, camera equipment positioned around the room, and additional lighting rigs brought in to give the broadcast the visual quality the venue deserved. Eleanor Price was 54 years old and had spent most of her career working in regional auction houses across the country. She was knowledgeable, composed on camera, and had been been building toward exactly this kind of assignment for years. A live broadcast heritage property auction from a historic estate was the kind of assignment that could define a career. She had described it that way to colleagues in the weeks leading up to the event. That evening, she stood at the podium in the center of the hall and opened the broadcast. When I read that she had described this assignment as the kind that could define a career, I had to put this down for a moment. The hall was everything the auction house had promised: original Victorian interiors, restored surfaces, and at the center of the ceiling, directly above the podium, a large multi-arm crystal chandelier that had hung in the same position for over a century. Nobody had thought to question it. That is not unusual. Things that have always been there tend to stop being seen. The production team had mounted an overhead camera rig along the ceiling that week. It was motorized, built to make slow tracking movements across the auction floor during the broadcast. During setup, they tested it for picture quality. It performed well. The rig hummed quietly when it moved, a low, continuous sound that blended into the noise of the room being prepared around it. The auction opened and bidding moved through the early lots at a steady pace. Eleanor worked the room with the ease of someone who had done this for decades. Above her, the camera moved slowly, steadily, the way it had been designed to. After several lots, a faint creaking became audible from the ceiling above the podium. Dust shifted slightly from the beams. Neither was recognized as a warning by anyone on the floor. The mounting point gave way shortly after. The chandelier dropped vertically as the anchor point failed, releasing the chain and sending the full weight of the fixture down without deflection onto the podium where Eleanor was standing. The impact crushed the podium structure and drove Eleanor to the floor beneath it. She did not move after the impact. The broadcast feed cut within seconds. Attendees in the hall reacted immediately, and staff moved toward the podium through the debris. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and paramedics arrived within approximately 8 minutes. Eleanor Price was confirmed dead before she could be transported. Investigators found localized dry rot concentrated around the anchor penetration point in the ceiling timber. The mounting structure had already been significantly weakened before the event was staged. The motorized camera rig, mounted along the same joist span, had transmitted continuous vibration through the shared load-bearing members directly into the chandelier anchor. The timber could not hold under the repeated stress. No structural assessment of the suspended fixtures had ever been carried out. No one had asked for one. The creaking, the dust, those were the warnings, and nobody in that room understood them for what they were. I am not sure I would have either. That is the honest answer.
It was April 2019, and the early morning light was still soft over the city zoo as keepers began their routine behind the big cat enclosures. The facility had not yet opened to the public, and the service corridors were quiet, the air carrying the smell of feed and concrete. As the day settled in around the sounds of large animals moving through their morning, Noah Bennett was 24 years old and had been assigned to the big cat unit as a junior keeper. And I want to be clear about something before we go any further. This was not a reckless young man. He knew the rules. He was following them. He was not part of the broadcast being set up in the public viewing corridor that morning and had no role in the live segment. His assignment was specific, stationed at a designated gate control point inside a restricted service corridor, responsible for confirming gate alignment and visually verifying the animal's position during a routine shift transfer scheduled to run alongside the broadcast. He was in radio contact with the senior handler managing the sequence and was not expected to do anything beyond that. In the public viewing corridor, separated from the enclosures by reinforced glass and multiple containment barriers, the morning news crew had already set up and the camera was rolling. The reporter stood several feet back from the glass, conducting a live segment on zoo operations with a senior handler positioned safely on the opposite side of the barrier system. It was a controlled, unremarkable setup of the kind news crews run at zoo facilities regularly, with nothing visible to the camera suggesting anything unusual was happening behind the scenes. If I'm watching this, it will look like a normal and safe situation to me because there were no signs that anything was about to go wrong. The transfer sequence began during the broadcast. The senior handler initiated movement of the animal from one enclosure section into a connected holding corridor, a process that required each gate to be opened and secured in precise order, with every step verbally confirmed over radio before the next one began. And this is where everything started to come apart. A gate was reported as secured, but had not fully latched, and at the same moment the animal was encouraged forward into the transfer corridor. It entered the system earlier than expected, and because the secondary gate had not properly caught, it pushed through into the adjoining service corridor where Noah was stationed. The mistake was small, but it changed everything. One gate not fully closed was enough to break the system. Noah had no room to retreat. The corridor was narrow and enclosed, and the animal was already inside the space before the radio calls had finished crossing over each other. The lion came at him with the full force of its weight, taking him to the ground immediately. The impact alone was severe, several hundred pounds of muscle driving him into the concrete floor of the corridor. The animal's jaws closed around the back of his neck and upper shoulder, and the force of the bite was enough to cause catastrophic injury within seconds. What gets me about that is that all happened within seconds. There was no time to react or move away. Everything happened too fast for anyone to stop it. What followed was that staff outside the corridor worked frantically to engage the lockdown. On the live broadcast, the reporter faltered mid-sentence, turning toward the enclosure as the noise drew her attention, her reaction picking up faint shouts and urgent movement bleeding through her microphone from behind the restricted access doors. Off-camera staff moved quickly into frame, signaling to cut as the camera wavered and the crew was directed to clear the area without explanation. Zoo staff initiated emergency containment protocols immediately, locking down the transfer system and securing additional gates to restrict the animal's movement. An emergency code was called, and all non-essential personnel, including the news crew, were evacuated from the building. Noah Bennett was found unresponsive inside the service corridor once the animal was contained and was pronounced dead at the scene. The live broadcast had been cut. After the incident, the area was secured and staff were kept away while the situation was brought under control. A formal investigation determined the incident resulted from a procedural breakdown during gate confirmation compounded by miscommunication over radio, and the part that stays with me is that Noah did everything right. The system around him didn't. The zoo suspended all media access to animal handling areas pending a full review. A lot of you who watched my last video on workplace incidents kept asking me to cover cases where the environment itself was the danger. Not a person, not a machine, just the wrong place at the wrong moment. It was June 9th, 2014, on the grounds of a community park in East London, England, where a local television crew was present to film a segment on community fundraising. The fair had drawn several hundred attendees under a flat, overcast sky, the kind of day that photographs gray and forgettable until it doesn't. Vesta Cairn was 25 and enrolled part-time in a theater studies program at a performing arts college in central London. She had been volunteering with the same fundraising collective since she was 19. Arriving before setup crews, staying through breakdown, noting what needed improvement for the following year. In the months before the event, she completed a short acrobatics course at a community fitness center, part of a longer effort to add physical performance to a skill set that already included stage movement and improv. When a TV producer announced they will have a segment for this fair, she had not been assigned to the dunk tank. She had put her own name on the list. I get the sense of someone trying to expand what they can do, stepping a little further each time, and it makes the decision feel personal in a way that's hard to detach from. Vesta had a history of vasovagal syncope, which can cause sudden fainting from stress or overstimulation. She disclosed this weeks earlier, and organizers cleared her with a colleague nearby. Despite considering restrictions, they allowed her in the tank due to her experience. No harness was used, the platform was 4 feet high, and the tank held approximately 4 feet of water, and no additional broadcast safety review was conducted despite the presence of live cameras. The tank was positioned on a flat concrete apron near the park's eastern fence. Around it, the environment was relentless, foam balls striking the target plate, the crowd cycling through anticipation and reaction, a loudspeaker from the main stage about 60 yards away running announcements on a loop. The segment was already live on the broadcast feed. Cohen, the TV organizer, was at the base of the platform when he noticed Vesta shift her weight and press one hand flat against the support post beside her seat. He moved closer. A second volunteer was already positioned on the access step to her left. The crowd had peaked. The noise was the loudest it had been all morning. This moment reads to me like the last chance for intervention, a small signal that something might be off, almost lost in everything else happening around it. The countdown from the crowd reached 1. A ball hit the target plate, captured cleanly by the broadcast camera. The platform released, the fall unfolding on the live broadcast as Vesta tilted forward, not backward as the drop should produce, but forward. her torso already without tension before the seat gave way. The colleague on the access step reached for her arm and missed. Cohen later told investigators the motion was unlike a fall, more like a switch being cut than a person losing balance. There was no corrective response from her body. Her head struck the exposed concrete edge beside the tank on the descent. Contact was at the right temple. Multiple witnesses described a single sharp crack that cut through the ambient noise and stopped the crowd within seconds. Her body continued forward and entered the water. Cohen and the second volunteer immediately pulled Vesta from the tank onto the flat concrete apron. Cohen positioned her supine and cleared her airway while the second volunteer initiated chest compressions. She convulsed once, a brief, involuntary contraction, then went still. A bystander near the barrier called emergency services, while several others stood frozen as the nearby monitor that had been relaying the live feed went to a studio segment. Paramedics arrived in approximately 6 minutes. Resuscitation efforts continued at the scene before being discontinued. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as severe blunt cranial trauma from direct impact to the right temporal region against a hard concrete edge. Findings included a basilar skull fracture, acute subdural hemorrhage, and structural damage to the right temporal lobe. No drowning was identified. The water was not a contributing factor. The collective posted a brief statement online 2 days later. Fundraising continued through the remainder of the season with minimal social media coverage and no publicly shared photographs or video from that day, and the broadcaster confirmed that the live segment had been cut immediately and would not be rebroadcast or released. A gathering at her performing arts college drew close friends and a few faculty members. No public ceremony was held beyond that. I have said this on this channel before, but the part that doesn't leave me is the paperwork trail. The disclosure, the review, the monitoring arrangement. Every safeguard that was supposed to be present was present. It still wasn't enough. That is harder to sit with than negligence. It doesn't point anywhere. It was August 18, 2018, in downtown Columbus, Ohio. Morning traffic moved steadily beneath an enclosed high-rise under active construction. Cranes paused between lifts, and a local television crew prepared for a scheduled live safety segment. The scene appeared controlled, while height, wind, and timing narrowed the margin for error. Marco DeLuca was 52, a construction foreman from Northwest Ohio. He had spent more than 3 decades on job sites, starting as a laborer and advancing to supervisor for a regional union-affiliated concrete and structural steel contractor. He was known for arriving before dawn, leaving after paperwork was finished, and addressing hazards directly. Workers described him as blunt, methodical, and consistent. His routine included handwritten logs, double-checking delivery slips, questioning optimistic projections, and requiring harnesses even for short tasks. Work was paused when conditions fell outside site limits. The interview was scheduled after recent safety concerns at unrelated projects owned by the same developer drew public attention, and the company agreed to a live segment to address those concerns. The interview took place on the 40th floor, where temporary exterior scaffolding supported facade and window installation. At that height, the wind shifted in uneven bursts. The platform relied on bolted connections tightened earlier in the week after a scaffold adjustment for material delivery. Marco's safety harness was clipped to a designated tie-off point on the same scaffold section, creating a common point failure when the platform gave way. A safety note recorded inconsistent torque readings on several fasteners, with retesting scheduled for the following day to avoid delaying concrete work below. That morning, a regional heat advisory and moderate wind warning were in effect, but filming proceeded. The segment aired live, and the reporter requested a clear view of the safety setup. Marco stood near the edge so the scaffold, guardrails, and tie-off points were visible behind him, while work on the platform was paused. As the interview continued on the live broadcast, crane activity resumed above to reposition materials. The movement sent vibrations through the structure and into the scaffold. At the connection points behind Marco, washers compressed and shifted around bolt heads, later confirmed to be under-torqued. The sounds blended with wind and traffic. The failure began abruptly. A sharp metallic snap cut through the audio as 2 bolts sheared almost simultaneously. Viewers saw the platform drop several inches and lurch. Marco stepped back as the guardrail bent outward and the decking tilted. Marco fell from the edge in full view of the live broadcast. He struck lower structural elements during the fall and then disappeared from the frame. Seconds later, a heavy impact sound reached the microphones, and the broadcast cut away. Emergency services were called immediately. Police, fire, and medical units arrived within minutes and secured the site. Marco was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as massive blunt force trauma, with crushed chest and pelvis, ruptured internal organs, and fatal spinal injuries. Investigators determined the collapse resulted from improperly torqued bolts that failed under combined vibration and wind load, with heat noted as a contributing factor to material stress. The site was shut down for several weeks. Fines were issued, inspection protocols were revised, and the broadcast footage was preserved as evidence and later used in internal safety briefings. It was September 2nd, 2015, outside Fresno, California. Late summer in the Central Valley means heat that sits on everything, dry air, bleached grass, and a sun that doesn't let up even in the early evening. The rail line that cuts through the outskirts of the city runs flat and straight through open land, the kind of stretch where you can see a train coming from a long way off. Most people who knew about that section knew it for one reason. The train slowed down before entering a short concrete tunnel about a quarter-mile from the nearest road crossing. Mays Flack was 19 years old. She worked part-time at a car wash, the kind of job that keeps the bills manageable but leaves a lot of hours open. She was social, always moving, always looking for the next thing to do on a weekend. Friends described her as someone who didn't like sitting still and pushed back against it by doing something. She had a small stunt account online with around 3,300 followers, enough to make it feel like one video could take off if they pushed it far enough. She filmed risky clips on weekends, usually with a small group of friends who were just as willing to show up and see what happened. Her friend Leo was 20, a year older, and the one who came up with the idea. He thought the slower speed near the tunnel made it manageable. The plan was simple: get on top of a boxcar while the train was moving slow, stand up for a few seconds, get the shot, and get off before the tunnel. Leo and two other friends would stay beside the track and record with their phones. Nobody had experience with railroads, and none of them had permission to be on the property. The train wasn't the unknown variable here. The tunnel was. The clearance above those boxcars, the gap between the roof of the car and the concrete ceiling, was not something any of them had measured or thought to check. That detail is what makes this case so hard to sit with. They arrived at the rail line and waited. When a freight train came through moving around 10 to 15 miles per hour near the tunnel approach, Mays grabbed the ladder on the side of a passing boxcar and climbed up. Mays made it onto the roof and stood near the center of the car. From the ground, her friends could see her standing upright. I keep coming back to this moment. She's up there, standing in the open air, and from her perspective, everything probably felt like it was going exactly as planned. The tunnel entrance was ahead. Based on witness accounts, she either didn't realize how close it was or didn't understand how little clearance there was above her. She was still standing when the train entered the tunnel. The concrete edge caught her at the head and shoulders. Witnesses heard it before they could fully process what they were seeing. Her body was knocked backward, rolled to the side, and fell from the boxcar onto the gravel beside the track. The drop was between 10 and 12 feet. The train continued forward for several seconds before it began to slow. Her friends ran toward her and found her with severe head injuries, not breathing normally. There was nothing they could do beyond staying with her and calling for help. The cases that stay with me are always the ones where the people nearby had to stand there and wait. That's what happened here. Responders arrived and worked at the scene, but there was nothing to reverse. Mays Flack was pronounced dead beside the rail line. She was 19 years old. Investigators documented the injuries as consistent with a high-force impact against a fixed structure, followed by a fall. The tunnel clearance left less than 2 feet of space above the boxcars, not enough for a person standing upright. The official findings confirmed she struck the tunnel entrance and fell from the moving train. The phones used to record were collected as evidence. Officers noted the group had been filming intentionally, and that none of them had authorization to access the rail property. No charges were filed, as the investigation concluded the incident was the result of a self-initiated stunt gone wrong. What stays with me isn't the risk of climbing a moving train. People understand that's dangerous. It's the tunnel. It was right there, and not one person in that group thought to walk the track first and look at what was waiting at the other end. It was August 9th, 2018. The highway outside Clarksville, Tennessee was straight and open, lit well enough by passing headlights that Caleb believed he would be visible. Caleb Turner was 20. He worked part-time at a hardware store and spent most of his evenings on his phone. He had built a following of just over 4,000 across his video accounts. He posted stunts mostly, small things at first, harmless things by his own measure. The kind of content that got shares because it made people uncomfortable in a way they could not quite explain. He had learned early that discomfort moved better than anything else he tried. Friends said he was the kind of person who never believed something would go wrong until it did. A reckless road stunt had been spreading across video platforms for several weeks. It was straightforward. Lie across a lane of highway at night, film oncoming headlights approaching, and hold position until the car steered around you. The videos moved quickly. They were short, high contrast, and built around a tension that was difficult to look away from. The stunt depended entirely on assumptions about reaction time, visibility, and whether drivers would notice in time. Caleb had attempted a version 3 weeks earlier on a quieter road closer to town. He had lain across the lane, held position, and watched a car veer around him at the last moment. He posted the clip the same night. It reached tens of thousands of views within 48 hours and was the best performing content he had ever made. The comments were split. Some called it staged. Others said the lighting looked edited, that the car had been too far away to be convincing. Several viewers told him to go live next time, that a live stream would prove it was real and make the content impossible to dismiss. He read those comments carefully. He agreed with them. Late that night, he and a friend drove out to the stretch of highway several viewers had suggested by name in the comments. They had described it as straighter and faster than the road he had used before. Both of those things were true. He set his phone near the roadside to capture the angle and opened a live stream. A small number of viewers joined within the first few minutes. He waited on the shoulder, watching the road. Headlights appeared occasionally in the distance, moving through and past without incident. Each time he watched them come and go. Then he walked out and lay down across the lane. His friend stayed on the shoulder. The road was quiet. Caleb lay still, watching the dark ahead of him. A car passed in the far lane without slowing. Then another set of headlights appeared far down the road. They were moving faster than the others, and they did not slow. The lights grew larger. Caleb did not move. Caleb was struck at speed and the car continued down the highway without stopping. His friend, who had been watching from the shoulder, ran to him immediately. The live stream continued recording from the roadside for several minutes after impact. Investigators later determined that the driver's blood alcohol level was nearly twice the legal limit. Paramedics arrived 14 minutes after his friend called 911, but Caleb Turner was pronounced dead at the scene. The driver was apprehended 6 miles down the road and later charged with vehicular homicide and leaving the scene of a fatal accident. The platform removed the live stream the following morning, though investigators had already secured the footage as part of their inquiry. Several hundred viewers had been watching when the crash occurred.
It was August 3, 2018, at a local television station in Columbus, Ohio. The afternoon had started normally enough, but by 3 o'clock, the storm system moving across the city had become the lead story. Lightning was visible to the west, and the radar was showing the kind of activity that pushed weather coverage to the front of every broadcast. Adrian Cole was 41 years old and had spent 12 years reading forecasts and explaining weather systems to viewers across central Ohio. That morning, he had been told informally that he was being moved up to lead on-air severe weather coverage, a step he had been working toward for some time. His colleagues had congratulated him in the newsroom. It had been a good day up until the point it stopped being one. I keep thinking about that morning. The congratulations, the handshakes, the feeling of finally getting somewhere. And then a colleague calls in sick and everything that follows from that single phone call. The meteorologist originally scheduled for the Rooftop Live segment had called in sick that afternoon with food poisoning. Someone needed to take the slot, and Adrian agreed without hesitation. It aligned with his new role, and it was exactly the kind of high-profile segment he had been waiting for. The technical setup on the rooftop was already in place from the previous segment. Nobody changed anything before he went up. The rooftop was a standard broadcast environment. Camera equipment, lighting rigs, and a fixed transmission tower anchored to the structure. The tower had been serviced 2 days earlier. During that maintenance, the grounding system had been adjusted and the bonding connection had been left incomplete. No post-maintenance verification or grounding check had been conducted before the rooftop setup was used again. From the outside, there was no way to see the problem. This is the part that gets under my skin. 2 days earlier, Someone worked on that tower, packed up their tools, and left, and nobody went back up to check. Not once. The lightning had been visible at a distance, but had not yet been recorded within the station's established safety radius at the time the segment began. Whether due to a delay in monitoring updates or a misjudgment of the storm's speed, the decision was made to proceed. Adrian took his position and started the live broadcast. He was composed and clear, tracking the storm in real time for viewers at home. The camera framing and fixed cabling position placed him within a few feet of the tower base. The control room was monitoring the feed from below. Lightning activity entered the immediate area as conditions rapidly worsened. A discharge struck the tower directly during the segment. Under normal conditions, a properly grounded tower dissipates that energy safely into the earth. In this case, the incomplete bonding meant the electricity did not spread out safely, which made the area more dangerous. A side flash happened where electricity jumped from the tower to nearby metal parts, and Adrian was caught in that path for a split second. On the live broadcast, his speech stopped mid-sentence. He lost posture immediately. The control room cut the feed within seconds, and backup programming took over. Viewers watching across the city saw it happen before the cut. The rooftop crew reached him within moments. Emergency services were contacted immediately, and paramedics arrived within minutes. Adrian was found unresponsive in cardiac arrest, and resuscitation efforts were initiated at the scene, but he was later pronounced dead. He was 41 years old. The cause of death was recorded as cardiac arrest due to lightning strike with associated electrical injuries. Technical investigators examining the tower determined that the grounding system had been left in a non-compliant state following the maintenance carried out 2 days before the incident. The incomplete bonding connection had prevented the tower from safely dissipating the lightning energy. While not the sole cause, this significantly increased the risk by reducing proper energy dissipation. The maintenance contractor and the station's technical team were named in the subsequent investigation. Adrian Cole had stepped in for a colleague, taken a position he had just been promoted to fill, and walked onto a rooftop beside a tower that nobody had checked before sending him up. He did not even hesitate when they asked him. That is what stays with me.
It was May 2016 in Los Angeles, California. Studio lights inside a primetime variety stage were running at full intensity as the evening's program built toward its most anticipated segment of the night. Adrian Cole was 32 years old and had built his career around high-risk aerial work, the kind of live performance that requires absolute precision from every person involved in the setup. He had performed controlled vertical drops before, understood the rigging, and trusted the system. Crew members later described him as disciplined during setup, someone who relied on proper rigging checks and expected redundancy systems to function exactly as designed. That evening, the segment involved a controlled vertical drop from an elevated platform above the stage, using a descender device connected to an overhead anchor rig to regulate his speed and bring him to a stop at a predetermined height above the floor. A secondary safety line was part of the planned configuration. Adrian was fitted into the harness, checked by the rigging crew, and lifted into position above the stage as the host introduced the act. The rigging assembly above him consisted of a primary anchor point with load-bearing connectors distributing force through the descender system, with the safety line intended to act as an independent arrest system if the primary failed. And look, from where the audience was sitting, everything looked exactly as it should. The stunt began on cue. Adrian stepped off the platform and the descender engaged, pulling tension through the line as he dropped. And this is where things went wrong. A primary load-bearing carabiner within the rigging assembly failed under load, the connector having been unintentionally cross-loaded, placing force across its weaker axis, where its strength was significantly reduced. Under the sudden load of the drop, the cross-loaded carabiner failed, giving way as force was applied across its weaker axis. The descender itself remained intact, but with the anchor point gone, it had nothing to regulate against. The system lost all tension instantly. With no resistance applied through the descender, the line provided no braking force, converting the controlled drop into an uncontrolled fall. The secondary safety line, which should have arrested the fall, had been clipped to the same overhead anchor rather than an independent point, meaning both lines failed together when the anchor point gave way. That detail is the one that stays with me. One decision during setup, and the backup became useless. Adrian dropped the remaining distance to the stage without deceleration and impacted the floor at a speed the landing was never designed to absorb. The force of impact exceeded the tolerance of the intended landing system, which had been configured for a controlled descent rather than a full freefall. The host's expression changed. Crew members were already moving from the wings, and the feed cut away within seconds. The stage was cleared and emergency services were called immediately. Paramedics attended to Adrian on site before he was transported to a nearby hospital. Despite medical intervention, he did not survive. Adrian Cole was pronounced dead that evening from injuries sustained during the fall, including severe blunt force trauma consistent with a high-impact landing. Investigators examining the rigging identified the cross-loaded carabiner as the primary failure point, compounded by the secondary safety line having been anchored to the same connection rather than an independent overhead point, rendering the redundancy system ineffective at the moment it was needed. The incident was ultimately classified as a rigging failure involving improper connector loading and a non-independent safety system configuration. And the part I find hardest to move past is that the backup existed. It was there, but because it was tied into the same system, it was never going to stop the fall if the primary failed. It was August 19, 2018, in Evansville, Indiana, outside a mid-size riverfront park, where a regional music station hosted a free summer concert broadcast live on local television. The evening was warm and humid, with temporary fencing, vendor tents, and narrow entry lanes funneling thousands of people toward a single stage as daylight faded. Linda Carver was 58 and worked as a payroll clerk for a manufacturing supplier on the city's east side. She had held the same job for nearly 20 years, known for steady attendance and quiet reliability. Linda lived alone after her divorce and spent weekends visiting her grandchildren or watching local broadcasts she recognized by name. She rarely went to concerts, but the station promoting the event was one she listened to at work, and the headlining act played music she recognized from the radio. The show advertised open access, no tickets required, and a family-friendly crowd. The event was produced on a limited budget. Security staffing was contracted locally, and the layout relied on temporary barriers installed that morning. The stage sat at the end of a sloped lawn, with fencing guiding foot traffic through two main entrances. The broadcast crew focused on the stage and crowd energy, not the perimeter. Attendance exceeded early estimates by several thousand. By sunset, the area near the front was packed shoulder to shoulder, with little space to move once people stopped. Linda arrived shortly after 7 p.m. with her sister. They stood near the back at first, then edged forward as the opening act finished. The ground sloped downward toward the stage, and people leaned to see over others' shoulders. Weather alerts earlier in the day warned of possible thunderstorms, but the sky stayed clear. As the headliner prepared to come on, the station's live broadcast returned from commercial and showed a wide shot of the crowd pressing closer. Shortly after 9 p.m., movement started near one of the entrances. A surge rippled forward when people tried to push in from behind, believing the gates were about to close. The fencing flexed. Security personnel attempted to redirect the people, but the crowd noise drowned out their instructions. The slope caused bodies to tilt forward, transferring weight downhill. The pressure built unevenly, faster than anyone could step away from it. The surge reached the center in seconds. People stumbled. When one person fell, others tripped over them. Linda went down near the edge of a vendor tent where the ground dipped slightly. She was knocked onto her side and pinned as more bodies pressed over her. Feet and legs struck her back and shoulders. She could not stand because there was no space to push up. The pressure across her chest increased as people continued to fall forward. The live television broadcast cut from the stage to a wide crowd shot as the music stopped abruptly. The camera captured people waving for help and trying to pull others up. Linda was no longer visible beneath the mass of bodies. Emergency services were called immediately, as security opened a breach in the fencing to relieve pressure. The crowd slowly loosened as people were pushed backward. When responders reached Linda, she was unresponsive. She was removed from the crowd and transported by ambulance within minutes. Several others were treated on site for injuries. The broadcast remained live as anchors acknowledged a serious incident and urged viewers to avoid speculation while emergency lights filled the frame. Linda was pronounced dead at the hospital. The medical examiner later reported the cause of death as traumatic asphyxia. Her chest had been compressed for several minutes, preventing her lungs from expanding. Rib fractures and bruising were present, but there were no defensive injuries and no signs of intoxication. The findings were consistent with a crowd crush on a sloped surface. City officials suspended future large events at the park, pending review. The station ended the broadcast early and did not rebroadcast the concert footage. Linda's family declined interviews and held a small service attended by co-workers and relatives. Each year after, the station adjusted its summer programming, but the live shot of the crowd pulling apart that night still circulates online, marking the moment the concert stopped and never resumed. It was May 27, 2018, behind a small auto repair shop in Amarillo, Texas. The Texas Panhandle in late May sits at that uncomfortable edge between spring and full summer, warm enough by evening that the air feels thick, dry enough that everything smells faintly of dust and asphalt. The back parking lot was a flat stretch of cracked pavement, bordered by a chain-link fence on one side and overgrown shrubs on the other. Nothing about the location stood out. It was just a quiet patch of concrete behind a closed building, which was exactly why they used it. Raina Prin was 26 years old. She worked at that same repair shop during the day, the kind of job that keeps your hands busy and your mind moving, and she was good at it. People who knew her described her as confident and stubborn in the best way, someone who committed fully to whatever she decided to do. She had been posting stunt clips online for a while and had built a following of around 4,700 people. Lately, though, the numbers had been slipping and Raina felt it, like she needed something bigger, something that could finally take off. Her friend Cole was 28 and usually handled the camera for her videos. His job was to set up the shot and stay out of the way. They had filmed plenty of things in that back lot before, nothing that required much preparation. This time was different. Raina decided to try a fire-breathing trick she had seen online. The idea looked simple. Take a mouthful of fuel, blow it across a flame, and create a fireball. She had watched it done multiple times, but those clips didn't show how much training goes into controlling the spray and the flame. Neither she nor Cole had any experience with fire effects. She filled a plastic bottle with lighter fluid and lit a rag torch soaked in gasoline, which burns hotter and less predictably than the fuels professionals use. Cole set the camera on a tripod about 10 feet away. The setup looked manageable, the lot was open, and Raina felt like she understood what she was doing. I honestly believe that if Cole had just said no, if he had refused to film and walked away, Raina might still be alive, and that's something I imagine he has to live with every single day. What happened next was pieced together from Cole's account and the footage recovered at the scene. Raina took a mouthful of lighter fluid and blew it across the torch. The first attempt worked. A fireball pushed outward and faded the way she expected. She reset and tried again. The spray came out uneven, not a fine mist, but a broken stream. Some of the liquid fell back onto her face and shirt, leaving fuel on her skin. When the torch moved closer, the flame followed that fuel back toward her. Fire caught near her mouth almost instantly. It spread across her face and onto her shirt just as quickly. The fuel on her clothing ignited across her chest and arms. She dropped the torch. Cole ran toward her and tried to beat the flames down, but the fire had already spread too far. She fell onto the pavement while still burning. Cole threw water on her. The flames went out after several seconds, but the damage was already done. Raina was unresponsive when emergency crews arrived. Responders found severe burns across her upper body, with injuries consistent with flash burns and inhalation of hot gases. Raina Prin was pronounced dead after being transported to the hospital. The official cause of death was listed as thermal injuries from accidental ignition of flammable fuel. Investigators recovered the bottle, the torch, and the camera. The footage confirmed the sequence of events. Authorities concluded that using gasoline and lighter fluid without training or safety equipment created conditions where ignition could spread unpredictably. Professional fire performers normally use controlled fuels, safety gear, and spotters with extinguishers, none of which were present. What's clear in Raina's case is that she wasn't reckless in the way people assume. She had watched the trick and thought she understood it. But watching something and knowing how it works are different things, and that gap is exactly where this went wrong. It was November 14th, 2019, in Raleigh, North Carolina. The apartment was modest but deliberate. A ring light mounted on a shelf, a background arranged with enough care to signal ambition to anyone who might eventually be watching. Evan Crawford was 29. He spent his days working the customer service desk at a regional freight company. For nearly 3 years, he had been trying to build a social media presence. His follower count had barely moved in the better part of a year, despite everything he tried. His early attempts had been earnest. In 2015, he posted workout videos 3 times a week for 10 weeks, averaging 43 views. He tried food content next, then sports commentary, then commentary on other creators. A handful of videos reached 200 views, but the growth stopped there. He tested posting schedules, captions, and trending sounds. None of the patterns held. The people he had started with had mostly moved on. Some had grown their accounts into something real. The outlet challenge had been circulating for 4 days when Evan decided he was going to film it. The premise was simple. Slide a phone charger partway into a wall outlet, leaving the metal prongs exposed, then drag a coin across them to create a burst of sparks. The clip spreading online made the result look dramatic, but harmless. Several creators had posted versions that gathered tens of thousands of views within days. Evan studied the videos the way he always studied content that was working. He watched the framing, the pacing, the casual confidence the creators projected for the camera. Nobody in any of the clips appeared to be hurt. The sparks flashed brightly for a second and the video ended. He told himself the risk was minimal. The worst outcome he imagined was that the sparks would not look impressive enough to upload. He positioned the tripod in front of the outlet near his desk and set his phone to record. After checking the framing, he picked up the charger, faced the camera, and gave a short introduction. The ring light hummed softly in the corner of the room. He slid the charger partway into the outlet and held a quarter between his fingers. The phone's recording timer was already climbing upward. He moved the edge of the coin toward the exposed prongs. The moment the coin bridged both prongs, the circuit closed. Evan's fingers were still touching one of the exposed metal contacts, placing his hand directly in the path of the current as the outlet shorted. The shock forced his muscles into tetanic contraction, locking his grip around the coin. The current passing through his body disrupted the electrical rhythm of his heart, sending it into ventricular fibrillation. Evan collapsed near the desk and lost consciousness within seconds. His friend Marcus stopped by the apartment the following morning. After Evan stopped responding to messages and calls the night before, he found him on the floor beside the desk, the tripod still standing in front of the outlet. The phone had continued recording for several minutes after the electrocution before the battery finally died. Paramedics arrived 9 minutes after Marcus called 911, but Evan was unresponsive at the scene. He was transported to a nearby hospital and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner later ruled the cause of death as cardiac arrest resulting from acute electrocution, noting burn marks at the contact points on his fingers and palm. His social media account still had only a small audience at the time of his death. The video remained saved on the phone. It was never uploaded.